Now, I think that the TI dominance fundamental fantasy is a fantasy of cleansing, alternately, a fantasy of purification, both words to designate the same thing. Some people will prefer the idea of purification, but I think, in fact, that if we wanted to be really accurate, it would be something closer to cleansing. The reason for this is one that I touched upon in a previous video. Purification is a pretty complex concept. You can't really grasp it unless you already have a facility with abstraction. It's a creation of consciousness. It has the complexity of consciousness. So insofar as here we're talking about a deeply unconscious fantasy that does a structure and allow your lives to have meaning, this is how people find meaning in life, through, in a sense, experiencing their life as a narrative that is structured by this fantasy. It's very unconscious, so it cannot be found, if you like, in its most basic form as purification, because that is a creation of complex conscious work. Cleansing is much more primitive. Cleaning, cleansing, toilet training when you're a child, the idea of cleaning, being confronted with this sort of constraint, this rule. It's an experience that is very primitive, very archaic, and very, very fundamental from a psychoanalytic point of view. Just like the experience of eating is, just like the experience of sucking is, just like the experience of biting is, just like the experience of holding, being held. We're talking about very primitive experience of the young psyche. Cleansing evokes this. You can see that purification doesn't. But if we wanted to translate this idea in conscious language, we could certainly use purification. It was interesting that a viewer, and not long ago, and I've mentioned this viewer before because their contribution was really insightful, they said that they thought a TI dominance fantasy is more akin to reduction than to even purification, to remain within the conscious complexity register. And that's a disagreement between us. Now, of course, I already addressed the fact that reduction, just like purification, is not part of the language of the unconscious. Very abstract, very higher order. A lot of people will spend their entire lives without knowing what this means in this case, right? But this viewer's point of view was that the TI dominance, of course, strong relationship to truth, strong relationship to paring things down until only what's true and what can work as operators together to combine and produce all the truths of the world in the leanest possible system is, if you like, the destiny or the destination of the fantasy that you see at play in the conscious life of TI dominance, as opposed, for example, to NI dominance, including strong TI users in INFJs who don't have this fantasy. NI dominance, INFJs, when I'm trying to describe the spiritual and conscious experience, how they understand truth, they'd be quite happy to add lots of new figures, lots of new images, similes, aphorisms to retain a certain degree of poetic vagueness, if it helps the descriptive power of what they're trying to convey. TI dominants don't really like this, or at least they see it very much as a first stage towards the ideal end of the journey, which would be, I've said this before, I'll say it again because it's a simplification, it's a bit of a caricature, but it has an element of truth to it, which is to have all the world, to be all that's true about the world, immensely compressed, extremely efficiently compressed in like a beautiful equation. Ultimate leanness, no fat, no remainder. That's the fantasy. For this reason, I think that reduction is not quite accurate. because although it is true that in a certain sense, there is a kind of jouissance, right? A kind of sort of ecstatic enjoyment that consciously or not the TI dominant experiences in like getting rid of the fluff, including in conversations with other people. We can see that they enjoy this, right? There is jouissance involved in doing this. For the TI dominant, I don't think that there's a strong notion that anything has to be invented. Everything is already there. You need to be creative to identify it, pare it down, find what is essential, and then combine that to get the whole map of the world. So it is to purify what's already there. Again, quite different from the NI dominant. Other types too, but for this type, that I know quite well, there's this notion that you probably need to posit lots of things, such as, for some NI dominants, a world beyond our world. Maybe a heaven, a paradise, a dimension that has Gnostic implications. It's a populated world. It's not a desert. It's not a desert landscape. There's no aesthetic affinity for desert landscapes in NI dominance. The whole notion of desert landscape, that's an expression of Quine, by the way, the philosopher Quine, TI dominant certainly. There's a strong aesthetic sensitivity, and what's more purified aesthetically than a desert, right? What's more cleansed than this desert landscape? So I think cleansing works. I think cleaning to me sounds too much like when the child does toilet training and has to learn to be clean. Maybe TI dominants would come to me and say, like, you're being too Freudian, too reductionistic, ironically. It's a bit about more than that. I think the idea of cleansing shows that it's not just something that in early childhood is experienced physically and with mom and dad, but also in fantasy, also already in the very rich, developing fantasy world of the child, which is immensely more rich and complex and variegated than his parents realize. Okay, so fantasy of cleansing for the TI dominant, fantasy of repair for the NI dominant. Fantasy of cleansing exists in the NI dominant as a subsidiary fantasy. Fantasy of repair exists in the TI dominant as a subsidiary fantasy. Hopefully that was useful, guys. Give me a like. It helps so much with the referencing, costs you nothing. Don't forget you can support me on Patreon if you want to hear more about all these in-depth, psychoanalytic, but also sometimes philosophical or just plain phone explorations of type. I have a whole library of deep dives. Usually the topics are selected by the Patreon supporters. The deep dives are 20 to 30 minutes. Recent ones were, what would an NI dystopia look like? There was also one on NI mysticism and magic. So if that sounds interesting to you, that's a great perk to have. There's also access to our Discord server, the Furfold, where you can interact with us live, me and the others, on an everyday basis pretty much. So it's a great place to be, and it helps me so much. Don't forget you can also get my books on the INFJ, waiting for the properly fully focused NI book, The Infinite Soul on the INFJ in the World, how to find meaning, purpose and value as an INFJ in the world, and the Ecstatic Soul, which is all about the INFJ's inner world, particularly INFJ consciousness and INFJ thinking, right? So these two books, Infinite and Ecstatic, really go well together, and they're indispensable if you want a deep understanding of INFJs. Okay, guys, thank you so much, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.